All right, Needy.
All right.
Start.
Okay. All right. First of all, a very good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this seminar series. And it's with great enthusiasm that I introduce today's speaker, Rasha Atwi. She's a third-year graduate student in my lab. And I must say that in these 3 years, Rasha has impressed not just me, but a lot of our collaborators with her strong fundamental knowledge, her independent spirit, and more importantly, her passion to learn new things. She's definitely one of the top graduate students that I've come across, and she's leading a thrust in my lab, which is focused on developing a computational infrastructure for performing high-throughput multi-scale simulations and developing machine learning models. So in today's talk, she will be discussing her work on designing optimal materials for energy storage devices. I also wanted to add that though Rasha's background is in chemical engineering, she has mastered a lot of concepts and techniques from material science and computer science to make this project successful. And I feel very proud and lucky to have students like Rasha in my lab. Without further delay, I'll open the floor for Rasha. Rasha, please take it away.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this talk today. And thank you, Nidhi, for the nice introduction. I will start sharing my screen. Okay, can you all see the full screen?
Yeah. Yes, we can.
Okay. Today I will be talking about our work on tailoring atomistic interactions in lithium-sulfur battery via a computational multi-scale data-driven approach. As we all know, lithium-ion batteries are the state-of-the-art batteries today, and they offer many advantages, including their long cycle life, their high practical energy density, but they are not suitable for next generation energy storage devices or batteries due to their lower theoretical energy density and high cost. On the other hand, one of the attractive candidates is lithium-sulfur battery due to its high theoretical energy density compared to lithium-ion battery, low cost, and the natural abundance of the element sulfur. But the widespread commercialization of lithium-sulfur is still hindered by a series of problems. Lithium participates in parasitic reactions with the dissolved polysulfide species from the cathode, leading to the formation of lithium polysulfides, which then travel to the anode and coated. And this happens during every cycle, making the battery work less and less efficiently until it eventually dies. This is a schematic diagram showing the process where the cycloacetate ring on the cathode is opened during the discharge process and reduced to Li2S8, which is then converted to shorter chain polysulfide species that are soluble in the electrolyte, and they travel to the anode and insulate it. And consequences of this process include direct capacity fading of the battery, high self-discharge rate, and decrease in Coulombic efficiency. So to have a successful application of lithium-sulfur batteries, we need to design optimal electrolytes and electrode-electrolyte interfaces to mitigate the lithium polysulfide shuttle process. And one of the possible solutions include the use of fluorinated ether solvents, which are shown in green here. The solvating power of these fluorinated solvents is largely weakened because of the high steric hindrance of the fluorine atom compared to the hydrogen atom in conventional glyme electrolytes or solvents like DOL and DME in lithium-sulfur battery. And the fluorinated solvents also participate in the formation of a stable solid electrolyte interface on the lithium metal anode. But the fluorine-based interactions in the electrolyte at this time are still poorly understood, and they require detailed characterization and computational studies in order to fully comprehend. The goal of our work is to develop a fundamental understanding of the role of these fluorinated solvents in lithium-sulfur electrolyte in order to establish design rules that would allow us eventually to identify optimal components that can achieve the best compromise between the electrochemical performance of the battery and the transport properties of the electrolyte. And this objective includes studying the effect of multiple variables in the electrolyte, like its composition, the concentration of the electrolyte species, the conditions like temperature and pressure and so on. And it also requires exploring very big chemical and parameter spaces. And for that, we use computational models, mainly our computational approach is shown in the diagram here, where we start.
Rasha, we lost your audio.
I can't hear either.
Yeah, Rasha, we lost the audio. I think she can't hear us either. Rasha.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yes.
we can hear you now. Okay, great.
Sorry about that.
No worries, but I think we lost the last 30 seconds or so.
Okay, I was talking about the database that we create.
Yeah, we didn't hear that part. Yeah, okay. Maybe.
Yeah, we start from a database of now, can you hear me?
It's still cutting down a lot. I don't know if there's something with the headphones.
Now.
We can hear you now.
We start from the database of the individual electrolyte components like the solvent, salt, additive, and we perform density functional theory calculations for these components in order to screen or down select potential candidates based on performance metrics like the electrochemical stability or chemical stability of these components, and these are relevant properties for the battery performance overall. And then we use the selected candidates in detailed molecular dynamic simulations, both in the electrolyte and at the cathode interface, in order to study the interactions of these different components in the solution and at the interface as well. And then from these MD simulations, we extract atomic clusters representing the chemical environment of these species of interest, like the salt or the cation, for example, and feed them to additional density functional theory calculations in order to derive more accurate properties rather than just focusing on the individual molecules like in the first step of the process. And all of the steps in this schematic diagram generate a lot of data that we eventually save to a database that we later use for building the design rules and also establishing or for the screening purposes. And while it might look like only a few steps are involved in this approach, a lot of tedious tasks are required, especially that we rely on different computational chemistry software to do the DFT and MD simulations and to perform all the analysis. And each of the software has its own required input parameters, file formats, execution comments, and so on. So there is a need for a framework that automates these tasks while allowing flexibility and reproducibility of the results that we generate. And in this area, there's a lot of successful efforts that have leveraged the advances in computational, advances in theory and computing to accelerate materials design by developing computational infrastructure and databases of predicted materials properties. And examples of these include the Materials Project, AFlow, Nomad, OQMD, and many others. But many of these efforts have focused on DFT calculations mainly for solid materials. However, modeling of liquids and solid-liquid interfaces, which is an important step, or these components are important in many materials science applications like lithium-sulfur battery, and in a high-throughput computational framework is still missing. And for this purpose, and because of the complexity of these calculations and the need to run tens of thousands of jobs, we built a multi-scale computational infrastructure called MISPR, which stands for Materials Informatics for Structure Property Relationships, in order to automate the entire process from job definition and submission to supercomputing resources, to data management and analysis, validation, and the generation of appropriate metadata to build the database that we use later in determining these structure property relationships. And MISPR allows calculating many properties of interest to lithium-sulfur battery, as well as other material science applications. Properties like binding energy, spectroscopic signatures, redox potentials, and ensemble properties like structural, dynamical, and thermodynamical properties of liquid solutions and mixtures. And over the past year, we used MISPR to perform more than 50,000 calculations, including extensive benchmarking to ensure the use of correct parameters in our simulations. We built MISPR on top of base libraries developed by the materials community, mainly Pymagen for molecular representation and file input-output formats, Fireworks for job management, and Custodian for automatic error handling and debugging. I'm going to give a few examples of some of the workflows we implemented and how they work. One of the DFT workflows is the prediction of nuclear magnetic resonance chemical shift, which is a crucial property for understanding structural properties of molecules or even clusters of molecules that we get from molecular dynamic simulations. And the inputs to the NMR framework are very minimal. The only required input would be the structure of the molecule of interest or cluster, but many other optional inputs are possible, making the workflow very flexible to operate and use. And the workflow in MISPR represents a series of steps connected together with a certain dependency, and these steps are called fireworks. Where each firework itself is a sequence of fire tasks. And a fire task is, as the name says, it's an individual task. Examples include processing the input structure, writing input files for the computational chemistry software that we use, submitting and running the jobs, and saving results to the database. And the results from the database are saved in a collection specific to NMR chemical shifts in the MISPR database. Using this workflow, we were able in one project to accurately predict the NMR chemical shift for commonly used organic solvents, mainly the carbon and hydrogen chemical shifts, and we were able to obtain a very high correlation coefficients with experimental measurements. This is an example of the NMR document that we save in the NMR collection with all the metadata like the SMILES representation, INCI, the functional and basis set used in the DFT calculation, among many other important information. And all of the results, including this document, can be shared with outside collaborators in the form of files if experimental people are involved. Another example of a DFT workflow is the binding energy calculation, which is critical for understanding the stability of bonds between species. In lithium-sulfur project, for example, it allows us to know whether a specific type of solvent has more affinity towards coordinating with the salt or with the polysulfide species in the electrolyte compared to others. And the inputs to the workflow represent the two structures of interest where we do the geometry optimization and frequency calculation in parallel for these two structures. And then once these jobs are completed, we automatically build a complex structure at a specific binding site between these two molecules. Again, we optimize the geometry of this complex and calculate its vibrational frequency. And then we finally calculate the binding energy according to this formula. And we use this workflow in the lithium-sulfur project to identify possible functional groups that we can attach on the cathode surface, a carbon cathode surface in the lithium-sulfur battery, and to identify mainly functional groups that have high binding affinity towards the polysulfide species that exist in the bulk solution. And this represents a way of trapping the polysulfide on the surface and preventing their diffusion to the electrolyte. For example, we found that amine and sulfide groups represent promising functional groups candidates that can be used in further or more detailed simulations and experimental studies. And the results of this collection are also saved in or the results of this workflow are also saved in a collection in the database for binding energies, and it can be used later to guide our selection of potential functional groups. The molecular dynamics workflows build upon the results of the density functional theory workflow in terms of taking the optimized geometries from the DFT calculations and calculating or extracting the electrostatic partial charges, which are used in order to generate force field parameters that are needed to model the interactions in the solution. And the workflow allows to do calculations in different ensembles like minimization, MPT, using default MD recipes or defining the user's own MD recipes or sequence of steps, and then finally performing the analysis on the output and trajectory files from the MD simulations to derive various thermodynamic, structural, and dynamical properties. And the workflows are coupled with analysis codes that we developed for performing different kinds of analysis, like the radial distribution function, viscosity, ionic conductivity, and other relevant properties to the electrolyte. And results from the MD workflow can be also coupled with additional DFT workflow in order to calculate the properties more accurately by taking solvation environment that we predict from MD simulations. A powerful feature of the MISPER infrastructure are the hybrid workflows that seamlessly integrate DFT with MD simulations. For example, using a hybrid workflow in MISPER, we were able to predict the presence of multiple speciation in a multivalent solution of MgTFSI2 and DME. And this solution is used as an electrolyte in magnesium batteries. In this case study, we performed cluster analysis from MD simulations and categorized these clusters into unique configurations, each representing a different type and number of solvent or anion species around the cation. And they also represent the exact chemical environment of the salt in the solution. And from these configurations, we computed their NMR chemical shifts, and we directly correlated them to the experimental NMR peak instead of conventional approach that relies on developing these configurations using trial and error methods that not only can lead to errors, but also are time consuming, and they also might lead to missing certain important speciation that's not possible to predict using human or chemical intuition. And also in the conventional approach, usually they try to match one structure to the peak center only, where in such dynamic solutions, it's possible to have multiple structures in the solution. And from this approach, we found that the most stable structure identified computationally, number one here, matches very well with the experimental results, with the possibility of the presence of other species in the solution, like number two. And this entire process was automated with minimal interference of the user. And the workflow can be used to study other mixtures as well, not limited to this solution, and other different concentrations, temperatures, and other conditions. Now I'm going back a little bit to the lithium-sulfur project, in which we relied on the MISPR infrastructure for all the computational work that we did for this project. And as I said before, the type of the co-solvent used in the lithium-sulfur electrolyte determines the solubility of the polysulfides and therefore the electrochemical performance of the battery. For that reason, we built a library of the fluorinated solvents of around 1,000 fluorinated solvents, only 2% of which have been previously reported in lithium-sulfur literature. And the purpose of building this library is to identify an optimal composition for the solvent. In our approach, we utilized a multi-step screening process to down-select the potential fluorinated ethers that have optimal properties, including the structural, thermodynamic, electronic, ensemble properties that we computed using the MISPR infrastructure. This slide shows all the properties that we included in the screening, and all of them have critical role in determining the overall performance of the lithium-sulfur electrolyte. And they can be categorized into 3 different groups. Derived properties, which are based on the structural features or composition of the solvents. For example, the molecular weight, radius, and van der Waals volume can affect the viscosity of the entire electrolyte and are desired to be in the lower range. Complexity, for example, is desired to be low as well for the higher synthetic accessibility to that solvent. Proximity of the fluorine to oxygen atoms is desired to be intermediate, because if the fluorine atoms are too far away from the oxygen, then it will result in a very high solvating power of the oxygen atom. And too low of a proximity can prevent the dissolution of the salt in the electrolyte. The fluorination degree is also desired to be on the fluorination degree, and also the electronegative count, atom count, are other metrics that can affect the solvating power of the solvent. Shape index is an indication of how linear the structure of the solvent is, and can result in improved dynamics if we are comparing 2 solvents that have the same molecular size. The next group are the Cosmo properties, including boiling point, flash point, for safety considerations, and the solubility of 2 common salts used in lithium-sulfur electrolyte, which are lithium TFSI and lithium FSI. And these are desired to be high. The third group are DFT properties, which are more expensive calculations than the first 2 groups, and they include the electrochemical window, which determines the voltage range within which a battery can operate, the binding energy of the solvent with both the salt and the polysulfide species. And these 2 properties determine the affinity of the solvent towards the electrolyte components. And finally, we have some electronic properties like the polarizability and dipole moment. And using all of these predicted properties, we can determine the region in the design space that results in the optimal solubility of the lithium polysulfide species. This plot shows the distribution of all the properties that I presented on the earlier slides for the library of around 1,000 solvents. And they are grouped into derived properties in red, Cosmo properties in blue, and DFT properties in green. And I'm also showing 2 scatter points to show how they compare to the properties of the conventional glycine-based electrolyte or solvent, which are DOL and DME. And for many of these properties that are calculated, we can see that there is a broad range of values predicted. For example, molecular weight, you can see the gyration radius, flash point, and boiling point. There is a wide range of values for all of these properties. But we can clearly see that the solubility of lithium TFSI and lithium FSI in these solvents are much lower than that compared to the DOL and DME, which is expected to happen. As for the DFT calculations, we performed benchmarking studies in order to determine the level of theory and solvation model to use in order to make sure that we get accurate trends in the data. For example, for the electrochemical window, we used a very high fidelity functional and basis set, the omega functional here. And the total number of calculations summed to around 12,000 DFT calculations that were automatically handled using the MISPER infrastructure. As for the binding energy, we used a lower level of theory because we found that it was enough to reproduce accurate trends because we are not interested in the exact quantitative data for the binding energy, but rather the qualitative trends in the data. And we performed around 6,000 DFT jobs for the binding energy with both of the solvent, with both the salt and the polysulfide. And with this approach, we were able to identify correlations between the predicted properties. For example, we found here that a higher degree of fluorination on the x-axis can result in higher ionization potential on the y-axis, or oxidative stability of the solvent, but a lower binding affinity towards the salt. So establishing these kinds of correlations is critical in order to identify regions of interest in space. Here, an intermediate fluorination degree might be optimal to achieve a compromise between the electrochemical stability and the salt solubility. We computed the binding energy of each fluorinated solvent with both the salt and the polysulfide with respect to that of DME, which is the conventional ether solvent that we are trying to replace in this project with the fluorinated solvent. So a high relative binding energy, according to this equation, means that we have a higher affinity towards a certain component compared to the conventional glycine solvent. So it is desired to have a high relative binding energy with the salt and a low relative binding energy with the polysulfide, which means that the lower quadrants here are preferred, and even like this the third quadrant here is more preferred over that one, because from which we can select the fluorinated solvents of interest, because they have lower binding affinity towards the polysulfide, but usually higher towards the salt. We also found that the degree of fluorination and the position of the fluorine atoms, where they replace the hydrogen atoms in the conventional glycine, can affect all of these properties, including the binding energy. And this kind of high throughput computational screening provides a qualitative trend on how the substitution of a hydrogen atom with a fluorine atom modifies the electronegativity of the co-solvent in lithium-sulfur electrolyte, and therefore its affinity towards the electrolyte components. So in this step, after we computed all of the properties of interest and built our database, we defined critical quantitative limits for the most important properties to be considered in the next step. In the first step of the screening process, we down-selected around 141 solvents from the library of 1,000 fluorinated solvents based on the salt solubility. And for this, there is a lower limit of 1 moles per liter for common salts of lithium TFSI and lithium FSI. And from these 141, we identified 139 solvents that meet the electrochemical window greater than 2.7 electron volt. Out of these 139, we found 84 that meet the safety considerations of boiling point and flash point. And from the 84, we found 41 that have lower solubility towards the polysulfides than the conventional glynes, but with a comparable affinity towards the salt, because we don't want to compromise the salt solubility significantly. And this step is based on the binding energy DFT calculations. And finally, out of the 40 or 41 solvents, we down selected around 10 that have relatively either have relatively intermediate or low intermediate fluorination degree and low molecular weight, or commercial based on their commercial availability for further evaluation. And this plot here shows a distribution of the properties of these solvents in scatter points, purple scatter points, compared to the properties of the overall library. Therefore, in this step, we can it allowed us to identify solvents that allow for salt dissolution in the electrolyte, can result in medium to high voltage cells, meet the safety limitations, and can potentially lead to optimal solubility of the lithium polysulfide species. The 2D structure of the selected solvents from the screening process is shown here. FLS4 is not a screened solvent, but rather TTE, which is one of the most extensively used fluorinated solvents in lithium-sulfur literature. This solvent did not meet all of the screening criteria selected in the process, but is included to show how it performs compared to the screened solvents. So in order to understand the critical role of these fluorinated solvents in the electrolyte, we explored electrolytes containing 1 molar lithium TFSI, 0.25 molar Li2S4, along with an additive in each of the binary mixtures of the standard electrolyte that is usually used in lithium-sulfur batteries, and another electrolyte where the main solvent is DOL, and a co-solvent is a fluorinated solvent from the 10 selected candidates. And we included all of these electrolyte components in our study in order to have a realistic representation of the mixture, rather than just mixing the salt with the solvent. The radial distribution functions, which are shown in this plot, reflect the coordinating strength between the cation in the electrolyte and other atomic components. And for example, for the coordination with the co-solvent, which is either DME or one of the fluorinated solvents identified in this work, we found that the strongest interaction occurs with DME, and there is a monotonic decrease in the coordinating strength with the fluorinated solvents as the degree of fluorination of the solvent increases. And this can be attributed to the additional steric hindrance introduced when adding the CF2 and CF3 groups on the fluorinated solvent. Despite the presence of the ether oxygen atom here, there is a strong electron withdrawing effect of the fluorine atoms that largely reduces the affinity of the solvent towards the cation. On the other hand, for the coordination with DOL, we see an opposite trend, where in the system that has the conventional electrolyte, there is a weak interaction with DOL because most of the interaction is happening through DME. And in the fluorinated solvents, most of the solvation of the cation is coming from the DOL solvent. So for the fluorinated electrolyte, we can conclude that the DME solvent that is conventionally present in the electrolyte gets replaced with DOL for solvating the cation. And For the coordination between the cation and the anion, we can see that there is a much stronger interaction with the anion in the fluorinated systems compared to the conventional electrolyte solution. And this can be indication of the presence of contact ion pairs in the solution or even aggregates. And this is, of course, not desirable because it can lead to reduced diffusion coefficients and dynamical properties in the solution. And there's also more long-range interactions with the cation here. For the coordination with the polysulfide, if we look more closely of the cation with the polysulfide, if we look more closely, we can see that there is stronger interaction in the fluorinated system than in the conventional electrolyte. And this behavior will be explained in more detail later. So some of the top solvation structures are also shown here, where in the conventional electrolyte, we see mainly solvents in the cation solvation shell. In the fluorinated solvents, we can see that anions are introduced. So in the fluorinated solvents, we conclude that there is a localized electrolyte that is being formed, where the lithium-sulfur is localized in regions that do not have fluorinated solvents. Here I'm showing the radial distribution function between the polysulfide species in the solution, and it is evident that in the fluorinated solvents, there is much stronger interaction, indicative of the formation of clustering effect of these polysulfide species in the solution, and therefore lower solubility. And it's also evident from the snapshots here, where if we compare dull DME to FLS3, the region is more heterogeneous. In the FLS3 solution, we can see much bigger clusters than that in the conventional electrolyte. We also see that with the fluorinated solvents, if we look at the x-axis here, which indicates the degree of fluorination, that there is a much higher probability for the formation of a bridging effect, where a lithium is coordinating more than one polysulfide species at a time, compared to the unfluorinated electrolyte, where there is a much lower probability of this bridging effect forming. So because of the competition to coordinate with the lithium cation in fluorinated solvent, like this competition is lower compared to that in the conventional electrolyte, this leaves room for the anions and the polysulfide species to coordinate with the cation, and leading to more contact ion pairs and clustering effect presence, which eventually leads to the reduced polysulfide solubility in these electrolytes. And here are the results of the cluster analysis that we performed, where the heat maps show the probability of forming a polysulfide cluster of a certain size between 1 and 7. And this is the probability here for the different electrolyte systems that were screened. And we can see that for the conventional electrolyte, there is almost no clustering of polysulfides seen in these electrolytes, in this electrolyte, whereas in electrolytes composed of FLS2, FLS3, 4, 7, 8, and 10, there is much higher degree of clustering forming. FLS4, if you remember, the one that was proposed in the literature and used extensively, we can see that there are solvents that are leading to much higher degree of clustering and lower solubility of the polysulfides compared to these solvents. We also examined the dynamical properties of each of the electrolyte systems, and this plot here shows the distribution of the diffusion coefficients of the cation and DME in the standard electrolyte, and we can see that there is some kind of coupled motion occurring here, which is consistent with the structural analysis performed earlier that showed that there is more coordination with the DME solvent with the cation in this system. Whereas in the fluorinated solvent system that has around 70% degree of fluorination of the solvent, you can see that there is almost a separated motion because this type of solvent is not participating in solvating the cation. overall, if we look at the diffusion coefficient for the different systems, we see that the diffusivity of the ionic species in these electrolytes is impacted negatively compared to that of dual DME, but that is expected because we have more degree of clustering and lower polysulfide solubility of these in these electrolytes. But if we take a closer look, we can see that the electrolytes that were screened in this study have a better dynamical properties than the one that has been extensively used and proposed in the literature, which is FLS4, especially FLS2 that has a better ionic diffusivities than that of in FLS4. We also computed the conductivity and viscosity, where for each electrolyte solution, the horizontal lines represent the desired limits, but we can see that most of them are not meeting these desired limits, even the conventional electrolyte, because of the presence of these polysulfide species that we included in the model. If we look at the base electrolyte that does not have any polysulfide, then it's meeting these limits. But once the polysulfide species are added, the dynamical properties are affected negatively. But for the fluorinated solvents that we introduced here, we can see that there is a higher viscosity and lower conductivity in these electrolytes, which is also expected because of the lower solubility and of the lower solubility of the polysulfides and the formation of bigger clusters. But our objective is to achieve a compromise between the solubility of polysulfides and the dynamical properties. So if we look at FLS2 and we compare it to FLS4, which has been used in the literature, and see that it has much better dynamical properties while it is still achieving very low polysulfide solubility. So it can be one of the promising candidates for more detailed studies in the future. So with that, I would like to conclude that in this work, we performed computational screening using the MISPR infrastructure. And we found that it is an effective tool, our method, in order to identify potential electrolyte candidates with that achieve the required selective solubility, meaning high solubility towards the salt and low solubility towards the polysulfide. We built a computational database for the fluorinated solvents of interest for lithium-sulfur batteries. We down-selected 10 solvents that meet the quantitative limits of critical properties like boiling point, electrochemical window, salt solubility, and so on. And out of the selected solvents, we identified some promising candidates that result in low polysulfide solubility while not compromising the dynamical properties significantly. And extended work in the future includes experimental testing of the screened electrolytes, exploration of other mixtures like ternary solvent mixtures of dual DME and fluorinated solvent, or other classes of solvents like sulfones, and as well as exploring the impact of the salt and additives in these systems on the dynamical and structural properties of the electrolyte. And with that, I would like to thank LG for the funding and IACS for providing all the computational resources that are necessary to carry out these different calculations.
Well, thanks a lot, Rasha. Let's open the floor for questions. Are there any questions for Rasha?
I have a quick question. So very nice talk. So I'm curious, so you end up with lots and lots of correlations, right? Like tons and tons of correlations between the different factors you're calculating. Is there any automation? Is it your job as graduate student to like look at every single correlation and see if it's good or not? Or is there some automation at that level too, where you can sort of automatically pick out the useful correlations?
So at this point of the project, I'm still trying to build on my on the data that I collected from this high-throughput computational approach and my chemical intuition or knowledge in order to understand these correlations and how they impact the eventually impact the structural and dynamical properties of the electrolyte. But one of the next steps for this project and other relevant projects as well is to include machine learning models in order to automatically detect these correlations and lower the chances of us missing that kind of like knowledge or understanding that is only based on the chemical intuition or knowledge.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, I wonder if even some of the like easier to calculate properties might be predictive of the more difficult properties in some cases.
We actually started that part of the project with the prediction of the solubility of the salt that I showed on one of the plots.
Yeah, that's right.
Based on the structural representation of the fluorinated solvents as inputs or descriptors to the model, and trying to predict the solubility of lithium TFSI in these different solvents, and predicting new the solubility in new fluorinated solvents. And the task here is not very difficult because our library is kind of homogeneous in its structure, meaning that we are limiting ourselves to fluorinated ether solvents, and there are very common structural patterns in these fluorinated solvents. That we were able to achieve a very high, like low mean absolute errors in the predicted solubilities of new solvent molecules, or in the test libraries that we had.
Very cool. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I'll steal one more question if there's
Sure,
one.
Ben. Yeah.
What kind of computer resources do you use? Do you use one of the local clusters, or are you able to farm this out to the cloud, or yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah, we use the Seawald cluster at Stony Brook University, and we previously used Exceed resources as well, because for the density functional theory and for the MD simulations, we need multiple CPUs and memory, large memory, especially for the DFT calculations that we do on the clusters rather than the individual atoms, because as the number of atoms in our system increases, they become, like, the calculations become more computationally extensive and demanding. But for testing purposes and for example, showing our approach for other people, we have set up like a cloud account where we run the fake calculations, like as if we are running the actual calculation, but we replace the DFT and MD steps with fake runs and use calculated output files, and in order to show like the flow of the framework, the flow of different workflows in our infrastructure. Yeah.
Gotcha. Cool. So the framework is there to do it on the cloud. You just haven't actually done it yet. Yeah, very cool.
We started implementing it, but it's not shared with outside people, because even MISPR infrastructure itself, along with all the other Python tools that we developed, are still private until we, like, they are still private repositories until we publish the paper for that. But we are planning to make it open source in the future.
Oh,
hopefully
nice.
in the near future. Yeah.
I just want to add one thing to Ben's question. So the whole infrastructure, the way it is made and the way, you know, the different files are set up, it's quite flexible that we can use it with different clusters. So we are not like tied to just one cluster, and that gives us a lot of flexibility for other people to run it on their own clusters.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's good.
Any other questions? Something from the students, perhaps? Okay. All right, if there are no more questions, I would just like to thank Rasha again for a nice presentation, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining the call. Especially I would like to say I'd like to thank the faculty, because it's always encouraging for students to basically see some faculty on their talks, and it just motivates them and support them more. Okay, so thanks everyone. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to Rasha.
Thank you so much,
everyone.
Yeah.
Nice job.